Hey, it's Mr. Tomac here, and today we're going to be programming a Rube Goldberg device. That's a very complicated machine that does a really silly job that's really unnecessary. And it works on this idea of a chain of events. One event causes another event that triggers another event and makes things happen. Now there's some very complex code inside this project, but the good news is you don't really have to understand it to make your own Rube Goldberg device. We've designed this project to be modular so that all you have to do is add a few little blocks to some custom blocks to make things move and rotate and change costumes, and you can make your own Rube Goldberg device. So follow along with me, and I'm going to give you all the steps you need to know to create an awesome infinity machine. So most of the code you'll be working with in this project is contained inside this object sprite. I just have a generic graphic set up here right now, but you can see that there are other graphics attached to it that you could choose to use in your projects. There's a hammer, a bellows, which is a machine for blowing air, and a boot attached to a stick, and a few other kind of typical objects that you would find inside a Rube Goldberg device. So for now, we're just going to use this generic object just to see how the functionality of it works. So this sprite, the object sprite, contains all the code that you're going to need in order to make your Rube Goldberg components work. The code over here on the right, none of this has to be modified at all. This is the real guts of what makes your project work. You don't really need to understand what's happening in here. You just need to use these blocks by deploying these red custom blocks that are over on the left here. So I'm going to show you one by one what each of these custom blocks does. This custom block called animation is where the real action is going to be happening. This will dictate how your object moves, what costumes it's wearing, and what sound effects it's going to be playing as it goes through its cycle after it's been activated, basically. So right now, by default, I just have my object moving 2 pixels across the screen 75 times. So it's moving 150 pixels across the screen. You can see that in action by running the program. Let's maximize our screen and click the green flag. And once you're ready to start running your simulation, just click on the start button. You'll see our object moves at 75 pixels across the screen and then strikes the next object and then the next one. And right now I have the same object striking itself 3 times in a row here. You can see that I've created this object 3 times, and we can actually see that over in the controller sprite, which is the master sprite that controls all of the different clones that we're creating in this code. Those 3 instances of the generic object that you see on the screen are being created over here in the controller object under this custom block called create clones. And you can see that we created 3 versions of the object. As we add more objects to our Rube Goldberg machine, we'll create clones of them here in the order that we want them to be created. To create our own objects to add to this Rube Goldberg device, we're going to have to use all the code inside this object sprite. So let's start by making a duplicate of our sprite. I'm going to want to rename this sprite to something that makes a bit more sense. I'm going to replace this generic object with a mouse, and that's going to be our first object that we're working with here. So I'm going to rename this object mouse. And then I'm going to go looking for a mouse graphic to plunk in here. So let's go to our costumes menu, and we're going to choose a costume. And I'll search for a mouse. Now we're going to want both mouse costumes because we're going to want him to cycle through his animations here. There are a couple of other sample devices here, but we can get rid of those now that we don't need them anymore, so that we're just left with our 2 mouse sprites here, and then we'll be able to use the next costume with this code. I'm going to want to have this mouse move in a 45-degree angle rather than moving straight the way that our generic object is. So I'm going to start its initial setup here to be pointing in a direction 45 here, just like that. I could also change its costume or do anything else that it needed to do to initialize its position before it starts moving here in this spot. Next, I'm going to change its already moving to the right by 2 pixels every time. To get him moving at a 45-degree angle, we just have to tell him to also change his Y coordinate in here. So we can't just point our character in a direction and use move commands the way we normally can in Scratch, because we have to fix everything inside this virtual world. These XY coordinates are happening across a giant screen that might be thousands and thousands of pixels across, far beyond the edge of this screen. So X and Y, meaning the X and Y positions that are dictated by these blocks, don't work inside this world. The only way to change coordinates is by changing the X and Y in these custom variables here. So because they're happening simultaneously, we're moving to the right and up at the same time inside the same loop here without having any delay in between them. These two are going to happen simultaneously, and it's going to make our mouse appear to move diagonally. To see our mouse in action here, we're going to have to add to the game, and we're going to do that inside this controller sprite right here. Let's click on it here, and you can see we've created 3 iterations of the object here. I'm going to change the first one to mouse so that we see a mouse on our screen. And now let's click the green flag, and you'll see that as soon as the music dies down and we click the start button, a mouse will appear on the screen and move diagonally across the screen. Now he's not hitting the object the way that we want him to. The object is just starting here in the middle and doesn't seem connected to him at all. And this is where we have to set these marker input points. I've got 2 of them here, a green one and a red one, and these dictate how objects hit each other. So we're basically going to want to set this mouse up so that when he ends his movement, his nose is going to be touching the tip of this object. Now something could be touching the mouse to get it going too, and so that's why we have to designate a start point for our object. That's the spot where it's going to be hit, and then an end point, which is where it's going to end up after it moves. So we can set that start and end point over in the mouse sprite by clicking on this apply coordinates custom block. Now your game must be running for this to work, so make sure you've clicked the green flag, and then when you click apply coordinates inside the mouse sprite, you'll see our mouse character is sitting here in the middle of the screen. I've got a green dot here that's attached to my sprite, and I'm going to click it on the spot where I want my mouse to be activated when it gets hit by whatever it is that hit it before it in the cycle here. So I'm going to click right on the tip of its tail where I want it to be struck. Then he's going to run through his animation. You can see that we're moving diagonally here. I have to make sure my movements are not so much that he'll go off the screen though, or this isn't going to work. So all your movements have to be quite small here for this to work. Now you can see that my cursor is turned to a red dot here. I want this red dot to be the spot on my mouse where he is going to hit the next thing that he hits. In this case, it's that little square object block. So I'm going to click on the tip of mouse's nose here, just like that. And then my program's going to reset itself. So now when I run my program, it should hit, let's go back to our controller object. So we've got the mouse being created, and then when it ends its animation, there should be a square object there that it hits with its nose, and then as soon as that happens, it will be, the object will start moving. So let's have a look at that right now. So we click the start button, and the mouse moves, and then whacks into the object, which gets it moving, which gets it hitting the next object, which gets it moving. Perfect. Now let's add a little bit more pizzazz to our mouse's actions here. I'm going to tell him every time that he moves to do a little change costume here. So I'm going to go to my looks commands and add a next costume, and that'll get him wiggling his little tail. Make sure, of course, that you've gotten rid of any additional animations in this sprite so that we only have mouse sprites. Otherwise, you're going to have your mouse turn into all sorts of unpredictable things. Alright, I'm also going to add a sound effect here. So before I start my repeat cycle, I'm going to start the sound off. We don't want it repeating itself. I've just taken the liberty of loading up a sound file here called squeak. So let's have that sound start right at the beginning of the animation. So next up here, I'm going to program my mouse to do something after he's finished striking the next object. And that's where this custom block called after animation comes in. Anything you program here will happen after the action moves on to the next object. So in this case, I'm just going to have my mouse rotate and take another few steps before he actually stops here. So I'm going to tell him to turn kind of 90 degrees to the right here. We're going to do that just by having him repeat 30 times and change his rotation by 3 degrees each time here. That'll end him up at a 135-degree angle where he's facing down and to the right. So we're going to have to tell him to start moving once he gets down in that direction. And we're going to want him his x coordinates to change. So let's put him inside another loop here. And we'll have him repeat maybe 20 times. And inside of this little block of code here, we're going to want him moving down and to the right here. So let's go and tell him to change his x coordinates, which again we have to change with these blocks here. We're going to tell him to change his x by 2. And we're going to want him to change his y coordinates too, but instead of changing his y coordinates by +2, we're going to want to change it by -2, which will get him moving down the screen. So the combination of those two blocks will get him moving down to the right 20 times. Let's have him change his animation inside there as well with the next costume. And then we'll just have him stop moving at that point, so the code will just peter out. Let's check that out again. And there goes our mouse. He hits the object, and then he turns, and then starts moving in the other direction a little bit. Beautiful! So that worked nicely. If you wanted him moving farther than that, we could just increase that number. Let me change it up to 50 here, for example. And let's watch that working again. Beautiful. One other touch I'm going to add here is while he's turning, I still want him to be changing animation as well. So let's shove a next costume inside the turn here as well. And that extra little detail I think will improve things quite a bit. So our mouse is moving around. And yeah, he scurries his little legs around and then moves a little bit further while these guys start moving. Perfect. Now you might have noticed another custom block inside our object here called add prop. A prop is basically an object that doesn't move on the screen but is a part of our story here. Every prop is attached to a certain object, so in this case I'm going to attach a cage to this mouse so that this mouse has a place to start running from on the screen. So to add a cage prop here, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to need the prop code from over under this object here called prop. Let's make a duplicate of our prop. And I'm going to rename this object cage. You can add any stationary graphic that you want here. I've created some sample ones for you inside the costumes menu, including a cage here that you can see that's set up here and ready for us to use. There's a few other objects as well here, like a box and a steel girder and a ladder, just kind of typical objects that you might use inside a game like this. Okay, so now that we've selected our costume, the cage here, well, there's no other code that has to change inside the prop object once we've renamed it. So let's go back to our mouse object, and we're going to go to the add prop command, and we're going to add these blocks underneath it here. These just position the prop. We're going to create a clone at the end here, and we're going to call it cage. And we're going to basically put its position down here using these blocks here. This, the way it's currently configured, there's no offset, meaning the cage will appear directly in the middle of the mouse. So let's see what that looks like. There's one other bit we have to add here, and that is under initialize at the very beginning, we do have to add that prop here. So let's go ahead and go add prop. And now, because we created the clone here, that cage should appear perfectly on top of our mouse before he starts moving here. Let's have a look. We'll click the green flag. And there it is. He starts inside a cage. I probably want that cage to be at the front here before he starts moving. So let's change its stacking order here. So under the green flag, I'm going to tell it to go to the front layer. There we go. And that'll make sure it's stacked up in front of our mouse. So let's run that code one more time here. Click the green flag, and you can see that he starts off inside the cage. Beautiful. Now there is an offset function here in case you don't want your object, your prop, to start right inside, right in the middle of your object. So for example, if I wanted this cage to be a little further down on the screen, I could offset it inside the mouse code here by changing its Y coordinates. I'm going to go here where it says add a coordinate to props X. We're going to add Y plus, well actually plus will move it up on the screen. We're going to move it down the screen by adding a negative number. So we could just go Y minus here, but instead I'm just going to tell it to add a negative number. So let's tell it to go minus 20. And now you'll see that the cage will still appear on the screen, but its position will be offset a little bit, and the mouse starts at the top of the cage instead of at the bottom. Beautiful. By the way, you can add multiple versions of the same object to your code. Let's go back to our controller and tell it, after it creates the first mouse, to create another mouse, and it will automatically create another cage at the same time. Let's try running that code. And there we go, the other mouse is waiting to be hit. And then he hits the next object. Beautiful. Let's try now to create another object that's a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to make another duplicate of my object, Sprite. And I'm going to make this one a boot that swings around to kick whatever the next object is that it's going to hit on the list here. Let's change our graphic to boot, and we'll rename this object boot. We're going to want it to appear inside our game, so we're going to go to our controller and have it create a clone of a boot right after the mouse touches it. Alright, let's go to the code for the boot and make it do something right now. So we don't want it to move anymore. It's going to stay stationary, but we're going to want our boot to rotate. Now we want it to rotate around the top of it. So let's go back to our costume and confirm that our boot costume is anchored at the top here. If you see, the center point here is at the top of our boot. And so that means that as it rotates, it'll rotate around this point to basically swing around and kick something like this by rotating around this central spot here. Perfect. So now we're going to want to rotate our boot this way. So right now this is at an angle of 90. It's actually facing upright at an angle of 90. So we're going to have to make it start at a rotation minus 90 from that, which is actually 180 degrees. So let's tell it to initialize itself at an angle of 180 degrees. So we'll go to our initialization, and we'll say point in direction 180, and that will get it positioned the right way. We don't need a prop for this boot, so we're going to get rid of the prop code. And we're going to make sure the add prop component isn't added here as well. All right, so now we don't want our object moving, we just want it rotating through the course of 90 degrees or so here. So we're going to want it to repeat 30 times here, and each time we're going to change by 3 degrees, and we're rotating counterclockwise. So let's have it turn 3 degrees, and once it's done moving, we're going to want it to keep kicking. So that's the spot where it's going to hit, and then after the animation is done, we're going to have it keep rotating. So let's move this out of the way, and we'll duplicate this and have this continue rotating after it strikes the other object. All right, let's go and preview that now. We'll maximize our screen. And here we go. You can see our boot's at its start position here, and then it rotates around and hits another object. Now it's not hitting in the right place, so again we're going to have to set up those initial spots for it. So let's run our program and then click on apply coordinates. And so we're going to want it to start in this position when the mouse hits the heel of this boot here. So we'll set the initial coordinate right here at the heel. Then it will rotate around to finish the beginning part of its movement. Of course, it'll continue to kick here, but this is the spot where it's going to hit the next object. So right at the tip of the boot here where we want it to hit, we'll click the red dot, and that will set the project up again. Let's test it one more time here, and this should be hitting that white object boot when it swings around here. So let's click start. Our mouse starts in his cage. He hits that. Bang, and then he knocks against that thing. I kind of want a sound effect to happen in that moment that that thing gets hit as well. So at the end of the animation here, let's go play a sound effect. I have a couple of sounds already loaded in here, including one that is a wooden tap sound. That sounds like it'll work nicely. Or we could go with a bonk sound. Maybe that one will work better. So let's use that bonk sound, and we'll have it play right at the end of this animation here. So start sound bonk. All right, let's test this out one more time. There we go. And it hits the other object nicely. So that's pretty much all there is to it. Now it's your turn. I want to see what kind of crazy Rube Goldberg contraptions you can create. Share them to this studio, and we'll take the best of them and add them to a gigantic Rube Goldberg device that we're going to be building during the course of the summer. And at some point we'll show them on our live stream. So if you want to add your crazy contraption to our Rube Goldberg device, just remix our file and save your new device into our studio, and we'll do the rest. Have fun!